Welcome, everyone, to our conversation this afternoon with author Kaya Oakes. First, I want to thank the Othering and Belonging Institute for helping to sponsor today's event, and especially Robin Pierce, who's been our amazing staff person to make sure everything goes according to plan. I'd also like to thank the History Department for providing space, and within the History Department, David Harris for being a very helpful point person. So thank you, and thank you all for coming today, whether you are here in person or online. We are delighted to have you. And I'm thrilled to welcome Kaya Oakes to this conversation today. She is a lecturer in the college writing program here at UC Berkeley and has been for over 20 years. Impressive. She's the author of 5 books, so The Defiant Middle is her 5th book, which again is incredibly impressive. Some of her previous books include The Nuns Are All Right, and notably that's Nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, Radical Reinvention, as well as Slanted and Enchanted. She's also written for a wide variety of publications in both the religious and secular press. That range includes The New Republic, Slate, Guardian, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Sojourners, On Being, Killing the Buddha, America, and The Revealer. And finally, in 2021, she was awarded the Best Commentary Writing Award from the Religious News Service. And she's long been a really thoughtful interlocutor in the realm of religion. So welcome. Thanks. And today we're going to be discussing her latest book, The Defiant Middle: How Women Claim Life's In-Betweens to Remake the World. And I just want to start by talking actually about this notion of the middle, which is both sort of a time, so a sense of time, but also a sense of place, and really that sort of sense of being. In several places in the book, you kind of have these wonderful phrases about being in between and on the edge, or being in the land of the liminal. And I'm wondering if you can just talk about how you came to this idea of the defiant middle.
Sure. So yeah, so first of all, thank you for those of you who are here in person, and then for everybody who's online. This is a weird time of day, so I extra appreciate it. But so I think that like this time of the afternoon is sort of a liminal space too, right? Because like most of us are done teaching or working for the day, hopefully. I'm looking at my colleagues over there like, don't work anymore after this, but and then we are going to move into our evening, and so there's this sort of like ambiguous time. And I myself was turning 50 a year ago, and leading up to that, I began to think about how ill-defined it is for women, the idea of like midlife or middle, like when does it begin? Because I was seeing friends who were like 35 saying they were middle-aged, and I was seeing friends who were 70 saying they were middle-aged, and I'm like, what are we talking about here? And the problem is for women, there's this sort of like arbitrary physical marker of menopause where we say like, now you're a crone, and like so as soon as, but some people don't go through menopause, you know, some people don't have the equipment to do that, and so on and so forth. And that led me to this idea of women who lived in historical times that were also liminal times. So as a historian, you know what I'm talking about. I went and honed in on the Middle Ages specifically because of the name, of course, but also because there were a lot of women in the Middle Ages who sort of exemplified living in between expectations of what a woman should be and the reality they were in. And that was something I think many of us are experiencing today. And that's that sort of like, what is a woman? How do we define that? Why do we define it this way with biology? Let's have a conversation about that. But also let's look at these women from history who stepped out of the prescribed roles and see what they have to teach us now.
Yeah, and I mean, there's such a kind of fascinating array of women who then you bring up. And one of the things I really enjoyed in reading the book was the way in which you moved between the present and the past. It was like a very smooth, as a historian, maybe I'm just too used to reading academic texts that are way less smooth. But really, I mean, one of the things I really appreciated was the way you were able to both capture these sort of past lives of people like Hildegard von Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Joan of Arc, but also some more recent folks like Dorothy Day and Simone Weil, but like Polly Murray, like a really wide range of women that, as you're saying, were in this space. And so I guess I'm kind of curious, the Middle Ages obviously offer, in some ways, a sort of set of options, because as you note, at one point, we only have what sort of is left. Often we have some of their writing, but also what's left described about them by men. And sort of how you kind of made the choices about who you found to write about and what you said about them.
Yeah, so it was thematic. So I went into this book, I signed the contract to write it in February of 2020. And so I've always had really great timing with the books that I had an article I worked on for months and months that came out on the day Trump was elected. And it was like, you could just feel the air going out of the balloon, you know, like no one's ever gonna read, nobody did. But I was, you know, we went into lockdown and I was just kind of, I had signed the book contract on this idea, but I didn't have an outline, which, as you know, is not how you usually do it. Usually with nonfiction books, you have an outline of what you're going to write, and then the publisher buys it based on that. And so my publisher was very generous and bought it based on the idea, but not the outline. And so I was in my garage at home writing an exercise bike, like trying to work off my COVID angst. And I came up with these themes of like age and bodies and minds. And so the book sort of rotates around those three themes, and who exemplifies women who dealt with the problem of aging or being too young, too old, you know, and then mental health and the idea of craziness and that pejorative idea. And that gave me a through line. And then I began to think about who exemplifies this, like in history, who are some people who exemplify youth. And so like Joan of Arc came up because of course, you know, she died at 14. And in her lifetime, she was dismissed as, you know, crazy, visionary, etc. And people dismissed her because of her youth. And then with aging, you know, I was thinking about figures in the Hebrew Bible of this sister of Moses, who we don't really hear much from, but she's this kind of wisdom figure. And so, yeah, so it's a struggle because most of the writing about, until very recently, most of the writing about women was done by men. And that was, you know, centuries of kind of women not being literate and not being allowed to be literate. So I tried to think of them like you think of a character and how you get to know characters in literature. And so you have the outline of this character, but then you fill in your imagination sort of like what they would be like. So I was sort of mentally having, this is gonna sound totally bonkers, but we all kind of lost it during the pandemic, right? So I've been mentally having conversations with Julian of Norwich, like, what would you say about this, you know, and like, and that helped a lot. And then I was in a writing group with my friend Stephanie Kalem and another friend, Liz Costello, and the three of us would meet once a month on Zoom. And I would just say, hey, I'm writing a chapter on, you know, on mental health. Who are some women who, you know, they're like, Carrie Fisher, you know, so on and so forth. So like they were just popcorn, like we popcorn names, and it was really great to have that kind of community and feedback. And then in the editing process, my editor came in and refined that further. So, and she's a really great editor, so she helped me a lot with that too.
So interesting. I'm always fascinated by process.
Yeah.
Perhaps selfishly. I was really struck, you know, the first two chapters really dealing with women who are too young or too old. And I was thinking about I happened separately years ago to be cleaning out a file cabinet of my father's after he died. And he was a collector and a saver, especially of his kids, all sorts of, things we produced in like preschool and elementary school and whatnot. And there was this interview that apparently we did in first grade. And it was sort of like, what do you want to be when right? And I had written, or someone wrote for me, I want to be an adult because and as I thought about it, I was like, right, because as a kid, I thought like adults, like, they got to like choose what they wanted to do. There was a certain independence with being an adult that you don't have as a kid. And then it turns out as an adult, I mean, at least by many of the standards, as you point out, I don't conform. I'm not married. I don't have children. So I haven't hit the boxes that cultures, and especially religious cultures, often assume I should have. And so I as I was reading, I was just like, check like throughout the process. And I was wondering whether, sort of writing about either youth or aging, was one of them trickier than the other, or kind of how did you grapple with, because it is, as you were saying earlier, like middle-aged is so ill-defined and used to refer to so many different things, but then to try and capture either side of it is also tricky.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to validate your life choices. I don't have children. I am married, but I don't have children, and I don't own a home. And so like I've sort of like a really like kind of unusual 51-year-old in some regards. But yeah, I think writing about younger people is harder. It's easier for me to look into my future at this point in my life than to look into my past. And I think that's because I work with students. Most of my students are first and second year undergrads. Sometimes when I teach an upper division writing class, I don't work with grad students. So I know all about cringe and the idea of like an instructor trying to be younger than her age, or like, hey, have you guys heard the Lil Nas X song? And like my students are just like, well, they're wearing masks, so I can't tell, but I can feel it. Like I can feel that like try hard thing. And so I really struggled in that chapter to think of like, what does it mean to be young today? And so I couldn't, I don't know, right? And so I talked to my nieces who are in college. I talked to people, I have friends who are younger than I am. And I really thought, again, historically about who are some women in history who embodied this. And then I kept coming back to Joan of Arc, who, I was fascinated by when I was a little girl. I was really compelled by this figure of this other person who's a child and basically goes out and leads an army. And I'm a pacifist now. And so I would never like the militarist. She's unfortunately been kind of hijacked by the alt-right, which has sort of embraced her as this figure of nationalism. And that's really not what she was. And so I wanted to reclaim her in some ways, but I also wanted to write about youth without trying to say, here's what it's like to be young today, rather to say like, here's what some young women go through today, but historically, here's what expectations of young women are that still exist today. So things like purity culture that are still part of our culture, or expectations, in some ways, the pressure on people who are 18 to come to college and know what their major is going to be and know what they want to do for their lives is ridiculous, right? I didn't know that. I changed my major 3 times in college, and I went to 3 different colleges. And it's like, I think we need to like allow, girls and women, emerging women, to sort of like define themselves a little bit more. And that's the same thing with aging, right? How do you carve out this space that you say, this is what I'm going to be at this age, rather than this is what society expects me to know that I want to do with the rest of my life when I'm 18? That's really not fair. So
one of the, I think, really thought-provoking element of the book is really the way you weave kind of contemporary cultural commentary with also commentary on religion. And of course, you've been writing about religion for a long time. And it made me, think about or wonder about really the sort of choices you made in terms of when you emphasized people's religious paths, which, as you note several times, sometimes like there are people, and Polly Murray comes to mind, especially as someone who is talked about in the legal realm, but often like her role as an Episcopalian priest is just sort of a sideline. It came up a little bit in the documentary about her. Obviously, it wasn't ignored, but that religion actually contributes something here. It's not just kind of a side note or like interesting detail, but actually matters. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you see, particularly in this kind of liminal space, what is the role of religion?
Right. So it's complicated because, again, I'm looking back from today, and I'm looking back from, and you, Ronit, by the way, is also a person who writes about religion and history like brilliantly. So I have, her book is called In the Stink Face, and so I highly recommend it, on the whole history of military chaplains, which is, again, like this really interesting, like the military, which is theoretically secular, right, is actually, it's like praying before football games, like that kind of thing. We like to think that doesn't happen, but it does. And as much as we try to pretend that religion's not part, I mean, there's a guy like out there on Sprout right now, just like trying to save all of our souls, right? And so my friend Jack Jenkins, who is also a religion journalist, says, his thing is always religion's always in the room, and so we sort of ignore it a lot of the time because it's uncomfortable, or we don't have a language for it anymore, or the language for it is no longer a common language because we're so, we're divided about it, which it's a long story. But I think Polly Murray is such an interesting, so there's a documentary about her that's on Netflix or Amazon, I can't remember. It's a brand new, it's by the women who did the documentary on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Polly Murray was a civil rights attorney. She was a Black woman who internally identified as male. She didn't come out because at the time, it was harder to be non-binary or trans. And so some of her writing is about her. She goes to doctors. She's like, do I have testicles inside my body? Do I have testosterone? So she's seeking affirmation in her identity, but she was a deeply religious person, and that drove a lot of her civil rights work. And I think, again, it's like when we talk about the civil rights movement, we're often like Martin Luther King, and I'm like the Reverend Doctor, right? So like he was a Baptist minister who got into politics because of his religion. And somebody was recently telling me about, I think I was getting mansplained about, did you know William Barber is a reverend? And I'm like, yes, he's the Reverend William Barber, who is wearing a stole and a robe. And so, yeah, so it's interesting how much to bring people, people who have very deep religious convictions, we don't think of them as being like a non-binary civil rights activist or but she pursued, and I use the she pronoun, which she used in her lifetime, but some people prefer he, but it's historians, as you know, are trying to figure out what is the language for people in the past who lived in between genders before we had a they, but people weren't using it like we do now. Anyway, all that being said, Polly Murray pursues ordination in her 60s, and she becomes one of the first women in the Episcopal Church to get ordained. So there's this picture of these, I think there's 10 or 12 of them, these 10 or 12 women, and she just looks so happy. And she looks like she's got joy in her vocation, both as a lawyer and as a priest. And so I think that's something we have to kind of like recognize as part of the communities that we live in. So I spoke 2 weekends ago at First Congregational Church, which is right down the street from here. They had that big fire a few years ago. And the pastor there is a friend of mine, and she's a writer. And so her vocation is writing and being the pastor of this community. And it was just so fun to like be there with them and to like sit on the altar. And it's kind of like this, except that it's in a church. But I was like, Molly, you have this really big responsibility to this community. And she's like, yeah, I asked for that. So yeah, so I think that finding ways to sort of like honor that, and also to point out the problematic side of religion, which you and I both have to do in our work, whether it's about feminism or politics or the military or whatever, where does religion not belong? If religion's always in the room, when is it not welcome, right? And I know you're working on that with hospitals, right, in healthcare, and the very many times when religion should not be in the room, like healthcare.
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciate about your treatment of religion in the book, and also in your writing more generally, is the care with which you don't kind of assume, as many do, that sort of there is this thing called religion that stands for all of religion. And that, especially I think in contemporary American culture, has often or frequently becomes a stand-in for a certain kind of conservative politics.
Right.
And one of the things you do so well is to bring out all the ways in which religion can be challenging, damaging, controlling, but also creates a whole different set of opportunities if you look in different places or from different angles.
Right. Yeah, so yeah, it's like, who knew, right? So I think it's true. It's important to hold religion accountable, but it's also important to not assume that all religion is the religious right, because they've hijacked the narrative of American, and you know this too. And like a lot of what we do in religion journalism is trying to take the spotlight and go like, like, and point it at something else, because the religious right is always trying to, let's be mean to trans kids in Texas and do it in the name of religion. Let's do this. And like, no, wait a minute, this is other church over here that's not being mean to trans kids. Like, can we show that? And it's really hard to wrestle that away from the people who have the most power over the narrative. So the work of people who do history on religion, do religion journalism, is to try to do that, to try to like say there's this other narrative, and like it's so not known to the world. And so yeah, it's a tough job though. Like, try pitching an editor and saying, hey, there's this church with a trans priest, and they go, yeah, okay, but Trump. Like, so it's just, yeah, it's really hard.
And one of the things, I mean, you've talked in partially in this book, but also in other places, about your own kind of religious and spiritual journey, and within the Catholic Church especially, which, has some less savory histories, but also as you know, like you're describing and thinking with and through women who have found places in the church, and not just in the church, but because of the church. And I guess I'm curious, actually, not just at both kind of an analytic level, but also at the level of writing. Like, how do you kind of like, what kind of your process is in terms of honoring what many of these women have found fulfilling and sustaining? I mean, Dorothy Day is probably like the modern example, but of course you've got also, women from the Middle Ages who are also operating within a world where the Roman Catholic Church was the church, right. And it put a lot of constraints on their life, but also they found other paths. And sort of how I'm curious also if it made you rethink certain ideas, or kind of how they changed your thinking and thinking about their own journeys.
Yeah, I think one of the really cool things that came out of writing this book for me was redefining the idea of solitude as a vocation. So I don't know if you know the work of Fenton Johnson. He used to teach at SF State. He's a novelist, but he grew up, he's gay, and he grew up right next to this Thomas Merton, this very famous monastery in Kentucky. So like all his life, he was around this tradition of solitary silent monks, but he became a Buddhist. And so he has a book about this project, how did this gay kid from Kentucky who grew up near a Catholic monastery become a Buddhist? And he has a new book on the history of solitaries. So like not necessarily people who were like living alone in a cell. So Julian of Norwich was an anchoress, so she lived in this little building that was attached to the side of a church. It was anchored to a church, and they call it a cell. It's basically a room. So like somebody brought food. One window looks out into the village square, you know, like we do here, and the other one looks into the church. And so that was her vocation, was to live in both solitude, but she was sort of in the communities in some ways. The window was open, people would come, ask her questions. And like the more that I kind of lived with that idea during the pandemic, when I was sitting alone at home, like I was like, you know, I'm really good at this. And all of my life I had felt really like strange or apologetic about, it's not the whole introvert thing. We've had that conversation. It's beyond that. It's to like women saying like, I like being alone, and the pandemic helped me realize that like I can actually do this. And I think it was that wisdom tradition that comes from even further back in the Catholic Church, to the desert mothers and fathers who were, you know, that go out into the desert and essentially starve themselves to see what would happen and have these weird mystical experiences. And like, it's some trippy, if you ever read their writing, it's like, man, this really is crazy stuff. And like, so in some ways, it's like the wisdom tradition was a psychological experiment of like, how long can I survive on my own? And then all of a sudden the whole world was doing that. And some people handled it really well and were like, this isn't that bad, I can do this. And some people really struggled, right? And so I think all of us were sort of in the liminal space, right? But I also realized that that kind of idea of like, I'm going to be on my own and embrace solitude as a power space for me, as a space of creativity, as a space of spiritual growth, was something I got from these Catholic mystics, these Christian mystics. Now, there are, of course, people in other religious traditions who did that too, in Judaism, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Islam. Everybody has a story in Native American traditions of somebody going off alone to have their, you know, experience, and then they come back with some kind of wisdom, right? But how many times was it a woman and they're like, what were you doing out there by yourself? Now that you're back, you can clean up the mess. Like, and so many of us are sort of re-entering the world now. I'm like, oh, you're back? Great. Here's this giant mess that we need you to clean up. But yeah, so that was a big one. And so it helped me to, and I wrote late last year, last year, I ended up writing a story on this monastery that's like up in the Berkeley Hills that a lot of people don't know is there. So there's actually a monastery up in North Berkeley with these 4 monks who are Christian mystics, and they live up there, and they live in this little house. They have no web presence, or it's very small web presence. You have to kind of find out about it to go there. And I was like, I loved writing that piece. And so that kind of story really interests me because it's a corrective, again, to the evangelical religious right. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me also the way, so there's the solitude angle, and then the chapter on kind of barrenness, and which also has a sort of desert element, and you know, women who don't have children. And I was really struck, the ways in which growing up, I grew up Jewish, and you know, the biblical figure who's always comes up is Hannah, right? And Hannah wept because she was barren. But what you then flag is like, wait a second, we have people like these biblical figures, these biblical women like Miriam, Esther, Purim is coming up, you've got Esther and Vashti, these women who play these important roles, whether or not they're hailed as significant, but do so not because they're childbearing or child rearing, but because of other kinds of power and authority. And I just found that really interesting to kind of rethink, or what are the ways in which you're reshaping some of the biblical figures. And of course, as you point out, Mary is often kind of smoothed out, right, by the church. And when in fact, you could think of her as much more iconoclastic than the kind of image of Mary as the figurine, or really just the figure of Mary as often presented. And could you just talk a little bit more about and the way that in which kind of these biblical women kind of came into this text and give us material to think about and think with for, again, this notion of this middle or liminal space.
Yeah, so not being Jewish myself, I didn't know the Purim story. And again, like it took a friend, and like I have a Jewish family now because a member of one of my siblings converted and is raising their children in the Jewish tradition. They belong to synagogue, all that stuff. And I've been to all these bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, and somehow I just had not gotten that story. And then when I went back and like paid more attention to it, I was like, this is so cool. Like that this woman who is described as, there's no mention, the Bible is obsessed with lineage, right? So whenever you get a woman, they're like, she's the mother of blah, blah, and the mother of blah, blah. And there's none of that with Esther. She's just, Esther. And so we can assume she doesn't have children. And so the fact that she saves her people is really amazing. So just sitting with like people who you sort of, this idea, so the statistic is these days that 1 in 10 women don't have children, and that's growing. So more and more people are either making that decision or just circumstantially not getting there, whatever happens. It doesn't happen for everybody, but the problem is it's always been a little bit of a shame stigma attached to that, sort of an embarrassment, and I really wanted to find people again who thrived. And so our Christian tradition is like Mary she's blessed, she receives, this amazing gift, but when you read her prayer, and she's Jewish too, right? So like you read her prayer in the Bible, it's called the Magnificat, and the first part is like, God's great, this is cool, okay. And then she goes, God's gonna set the world upside down, he's gonna send the rich away, he's gonna send, he's gonna raise up the poor. What God wants for the world is this upside down kingdom, and like where, woe to the rich, which Jesus repeats later on. I always want to get a bumper sticker that says that and like drive around like my gentrified neighborhood in Oakland and see how people react, like woe to the rich. But it sounds like Bernie Sanders, right? So, but so that's sort of, I was recently on this podcast with these two women who grew up evangelical, and they're like, in our church, we only read the first half of Mary's prayer where she talks about how great it is to be chosen by God. And I'm like, so you never got to the revolutionary part? And they're like, no. I'm like, okay, so I think many of us were stuck there, in my own generation. And then deliberately, people were not being taught about this. And then also the fact that there's, it's an immaculate conception. It's like she didn't actually have sex and somehow got pregnant. Like there's a lot of like weird kind of, but now it's like, wait a minute. So we celebrate when single women do the same thing, right? And like when queer families are made with, and it's so interesting how you can rethink these models of like people who were quote unquote barren and weeping and so on and so forth, but like actually those people do a lot of kind of cool stuff. And so that's sort of the second part of the narrative that sort of gets glossed over, kind of like my evangelical podcast friends. And that was really interesting to me as someone who doesn't have children myself. I recently was talking to a friend of mine who's an Anglican priest, and she was saying she chose not to have children too. And she said, it's really funny, a lot of times people will sort of interrogate her and like, who's going to take care of you when you're old? And she's like, as a person who goes to nursing homes to visit very lonely old people whose children never come visit them, I'm just not going to say that's a good reason to have kids. So I think we're having more conversations like that. And Rebecca Solnit has probably my favorite comeback ever. When people ask you if you have children, you say no. You say, would you ask a man that? So, yeah.
Right. And as you point out, of course, within the Catholic Church, women religious sisters, they do not have children, priests do not have children, and yet it remains this real kind of third wheel in some ways. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was you, but I could be mixing up my Twitter, people in my Twitter feed, noted, I guess, a couple of weeks ago, and even the Pope, who can be the current Pope, who is, often considered progressive in many domains, climate change, other things, but when it came to sort of the status of the family and having children, even though he, an unmarried priest, does not have children, it was still like, that's where the emphasis is.
Yeah.
So that tension within religious traditions over there are these figures that have been tremendously important, and also.
Yeah, so it's sort of like, again, looking back and sort of like combing through history and finding the outliers and sort of saying, how can I make this person into a role model who's been forgotten by history or looked over by history, or, only had half of their story told.
And we're gonna take questions from the audience. So start to think of your questions, whether you're on Zoom or here. As you think about your questions, I just want to get back to, you wrote this book during the pandemic, which to me seems just like a tremendous feat unto itself. I mean, yes, we had
something.
I know, but I do just want to really recognize that as a really huge accomplishment. But also, both because you're a writer and you teach writing, to talk just a little bit more about your writing process. As you said earlier, right, you got the contract without a full outline or a draft, but then I love hearing about how people write and how they revise. And so I'd love to just hear, if you're willing to talk a little bit about just what your process is.
Yeah, so I want to plug something first, which is that my department college writing program hosts an event every year called Berkeley Writers at Work, hosted by John Levine, who's here. And John is a playwright and also writer, and we co-teach creative writing together sometimes when there's not a pandemic. And every semester we pick a person from a different department and you interview them about their writing process. And it's really just about how do people here at the university write. So we've got like, how long has this been going on?
It'll be 26 years.
26 years, and many of these were filmed. And so if you want to see like Ron Takaki, or did you do Robert Reich? Did Steve do him? Yes.
Yeah.
Or most recently it was Scott Saul, who's a historian who teaches in the English department here at Berkeley. Please check those out. But for me, like, my process is very sloppy and I don't recommend it. So thankfully none of my students are here. So, so when I teach them things like always have an outline and do your research ahead of time, and I'm like on Google at 2 a.m. after having woken up in a sweat, just like thinking like, who was that person in the Bible who did this? And like, being on Twitter going, does anybody know the answer to this question? Right, like urgently need this fact. But I'm very process driven in the sense that I need deadlines to operate. And so one nice thing about having to write books on a schedule is that you don't get the second half of your advance unless you turn in the manuscript. And so like there's a financial incentive, but there's also a publication date, and the publisher has invested like the cover. You see the cover like way before the book comes out. You have to get people to endorse the book before you've even finished writing it. A lot of this is operating on years into the future, and so this little amoeba of an idea that you have has to become a living being. And so I'm very driven by like, I have to finish this thing. I don't have a choice, like, and I'm just going to sit here and work until I'm done. And so when I'm not working on deadlines, I have to set my own deadlines, and like for things like writing articles. So I'm a journalist also. And those are also deadline driven, and they're also news cycle driven. So the news cycle is changing so fast that your story, like me publishing that story, I did this research. I got to talk about this because I had loved write research. I wrote this article about this Black Catholic church in Oakland where I live, and they have this display. It's on San Pablo and Alcatraz, if any of you have ever, of crosses in the yard. And every time someone is killed in Oakland by gun violence, they put a cross in the yard. You know what I'm talking about, Michelle. And like somebody had complained about it, and somebody in the neighborhood had said, this is disturbing, and it's bringing down the real estate value. And I said, there's got to be a deeper story here. So how did this get started? Who started it? What does it mean now? And that neighborhood is gentrifying, and it's mostly white people. So the church has become a commuter church, and people are driving in from Antioch and Marin City and like all over the place because they can't afford to live in Oakland anymore. And so I really wanted to, tell this story, but through their point of view. So I spent months on this, and journalism is really about finding the person who's going to tell you the arc of the story. So who's the person, the community is going to tell you how to tell their story. So you interview lots of people, you sort of find a narrative arc. So like, what's the climax? And then how do you build up to that? And so the climax is sort of like, are they going to get to, keep doing this every year and put these crosses out there? Of course they are, but like, I need to build the tension. And I really loved writing that piece, and then it comes out on the day Trump's elected, and like nobody reads it. And so did I waste my time? My process was very driven by this idea, as it was with this book. A lot of my work is driven by, I want to tell this, I met this person, or I read about this person, and I think people need to know about them, right? And that's kind of why I write. It's not ego driven, and it's ego, everything's ego driven in the sense that I have an ego, but I do really consider myself somebody who, my purpose in life is to, hold a microphone to somebody's face, and whether that's Joan of Arc or, the people at St. Columba Church, and to kind of like help them get their story out there. I didn't waste my time. They were really happy about it. It brought attention to them. It was really sweet. I came to mass there a week later, and the priest had me like stand up, and it was just like, okay, that was not a waste of time, because it meant something. And so my process is, again, like, it's a messy process, but like I always have the end goal in sight. So one of the things I always tell my students, the other advice I give them, I don't live by, and that's okay, because like I also tell them everybody has their own process, and you have to find your own. But like one of the things I always say is you have to earn your ending, right? And so that for me is very much true. I know where a book's going to end. I have that in my mind from the beginning. I know where an essay is going to end, and I try to get there just as however I can get there. So yeah.
No, that's it's great. The messiness of writing is, I think, something that most people who write can share. And I have personally never been able to outline anything in advance. So anyone who can has my deep respect.
So another thing I teach my students is to outline the draft after you write it, and then like, oh, this is a mess, I can fix this, right? So that's often what editors do.
I'm a big fan of the reverse outline.
Yes.
Absolutely. So I do want to give a chance for questions from the audience. If you're online on Zoom, please put your questions in the chat, and Robin will read them out loud on your behalf. And those of you in the room with us today, just raise your hand. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I'm actually interested in both of your commentary, as a storyteller, you as a historian. It feels to me, and this is very biased perspective, but that if we look at it as a spectrum, we have the secular heroes and the deeply religious heroes, who are the majority mainly males or described males. And then it feels like women were always really good at being in between, where this secularity was interlaced with a bit of moral spirituality, and that was not allowed by any of the sides. So I was wondering if it's true, if this in between of interlaced spirituality with science or with other types of knowledge is indeed historically mainly feminine. And what's your comment about that if you discovered someone like Archetypes that stood in the middle and that actually could
Mhm.
bring some spectral change.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. You know, how do people stand in between? It's sort of like, if I'm getting your question right, and also to repeat it back to people who are watching online, you know, why is it that historically that there's a sort of like separation between like intellectual, scientific equals male, and then like the kind of like emotional, emotive, spiritual equals female? Is that kind of, and like,
But also on the other side, right?
Yeah.
Male also as the Pope, as this powerful, very religious.
mhm.
As long as it's powerful, it seems to be male, and then in between it seems to have to be destroyed.
Right, so men are always in power, and then, so historically, women who try to assume power and like step out of their kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? It's getting late in the day now, like, you know, their place.
They're private and like the
Yeah.
family is a sort of private sphere.
So like one of my favorites, and she's the epigraph of the book, is Mary Ward. And so Mary Ward was English nun, NUN, right? And who lived, and she wanted to start a religious order that was a female version of the Jesuits. So the Jesuits is the religious order that Pope Francis is part of, and they're kind of like, they're super intellectual. They run like Georgetown, Fordham, all these really high-ranking universities, but there's no women Jesuits. So in some religious orders like Franciscan, St. Francis always had women and men following him. And but there were all men, and they were very militaristic. St. Ignatius, who founded the order, he was a veteran of war. And Mary Ward wanted to start a religious order of women who would be intellectually, you know, like teaching other women how to read and write. And it didn't work. She was put into prison for this, and she was persecuted for it. And she eventually did start a religious order, but it never got to the institutional church wouldn't let her be what she had dreamed of. But she really pushed for this, and she really stepped out of, and like Hildegard and other women, she traveled to Rome at a time when women traveling alone in and of itself was very unusual. And she went directly to the source, you know, to make this request. And so I found her history very inspiring and very interesting to read. But have you run across examples in your own research?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question about kind of where, as you said, sort of mentioned the word archetype, and kind of where, particularly as you were, I think also gesturing out that there are sort of hero figures, and if they're men, it tends to be about power and intellect. And when it's women heroines, it does tend to have a kind of family orientation. You know, I'm having trouble coming up with a really great example, but I would say from sort of one of the things historians do is think about patterns. And I think that when we think about women who have taken on leadership roles, whether in religious communities or in political communities, you know, in society, and you get at this a little bit in the book, that even with whether it's Hillary Clinton or Elizabeth Warren, these, you know, women kind of on the verge of kind of the possibility of these powerful political roles, that they do tend still to have to be able to make a case for themselves as being sort of good women in a way that is socially and culturally accepted as wives, as mothers, grandmothers, that this is sort of important for framing who they are. And there are certainly women who have been in you know, positions of great power in a lot of different fields, but they are still unusual, right? They're not yet the typical people. And sociologically, when women enter professions, it's also when professions tend to be then perceived as losing status. Teaching, nursing, spaces, in fact, where nuns, NUNs, were actually particularly active in the United States, are then places that that tend where male teachers in the early United States had been pursued. That was an important role as women became the teaching force, the nursing force.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me to hear to this day stories from women who are coming to universities to interview for tenure track jobs who are visibly pregnant, that like they're greeted with anxiety by their committees. And I have a friend who was pregnant while she was in grad school here, and like that is treated us as kind of like, oh my God, is she going to give birth right in front of us? And like, will you need maternity leave? Okay, like how are we going to handle that? Oh my God. And so it's sort of like that, it's like, so be a traditional woman, but not like in our face, like don't put it in for, don't nurse like the breastfeeding debate. Why are we having that in 2022? It's like, it's a boob, it makes milk, babies eat it. That's how it works. Why are we having to hide that kind of thing still? But I think it is that sense of like, a lot of what, I don't know if everybody watches Broad City. It's a sitcom. It's very silly in some ways, but it's also very good on like women and archetypes and about particularly millennials. And there's an episode where the two kind of like pot smoking New York millennial Jewish comedians who host it, hilarious, who are the two main characters. They go to work for Hillary Clinton when she's running for president, and everybody's calling the office and like, all day they're answering the phones going, no, she's not a witch. Like that's the running joke. Like, no, she's not a witch. Okay, she's not a witch. But like that actually, really made me laugh, because that was the narrative, that people ran with her, is like that she was Lady Macbeth. So that archetype of like she's a villainous schemer. And they did it again with Warren, like putting little snake emojis and like calling her a snake. And, it's just, again, just kind of like the same old stereotypes that we have today. I'd be fascinated, and I don't think we'll see it in my lifetime, to see a woman without children become president, unless something happens to Biden and Harris gets like, because she's a stepmother. So people didn't know what to do with her either. They're like, well, look at these kids that she helped raise, that call her Mamala, and that's cute, right? Like that shows that she has a maternal side. Like, well, she didn't get married until she was 50 something, so she wasn't going to have biological children, and that was a choice she made, and that's okay, So yeah, so we sort of avoid the conversation a lot of the time.
And I think also even, over the past few decades where you have seen more women in religious leadership roles, there's also still that same tension over like, who are they? Can they fulfill all the roles we're expecting them to fulfill?
Absolutely. People always say, whenever you meet people who find out you're Catholic and you're a feminist, they're like, why don't you become Episcopalian? They have women priests. And I'm like, I have friends who are Episcopal priests. They still have sexism. Like, it's not like it stopped just because they started in, and it's the same in the rabbis, right? So a friend of mine is a female rabbi, and I'm like, do you ever get mansplained? She looks at me, she goes, what do you think? So,
yeah.
We have some questions from online. I know we probably have more in the room. Sorry for those of you, my back is too. This is one question going back to the very beginning. It's actually a question for you, Ronit. Shannon says she said, I think I heard you say that religion doesn't have a space or role in healthcare. Was that correct, or did I mishear? Could you elaborate? So would you like a chance to tell us about your forthcoming work?
This is a space that Kaya and I have previously been in conversation about. And so I am working on a project about religious healthcare. So there is a long history of religion and healthcare. The debate is really over whether there should be as much religion in healthcare as we see in the United States, where there are huge religious healthcare systems, some of which more or less actively use religious doctrine to determine care. So it's a big sprawling project that hopefully in a few years I'll have a book to share. But the center, and I think what was being referred to earlier was that this is a real debate, and we both have a tremendous amount of religion in healthcare today. But that is not uncontested. And so what I'm looking at is the ways how religious hospitals and religious healthcare systems frame themselves as religious, or sometimes they frame themselves as not really religious, and how debates over religious healthcare have evolved and developed over the past century or so.
We'll do maybe one more in person, then we'll go back to online.
I wanted to ask you about how you came up with some of the themes that you chose in the chapter headings. Did it just come to you, or did you find out as you were writing? Did it help you choose which women's stories to focus on? How did those categories help you write or think about this?
Yeah, so the question is, how did I come up with the themes in the book? And it's kind of a chicken egg question, right? So like I talked about before, how I often know how a book or an essay is going to end when so like I have that trajectory in my head, even if I don't have an outline, like I know I'm going to get to the end, but I really didn't know with this book because the world sort of like flipped out, right? But I did know that what I sat down and I thought about was, what are the ways that women are expected to be? So that was how I came up with the themes. And I thought we're expected to be nurturing, and mothering is part of that. We're expected to be caring and compassionate, and we're expected to be calm and like not to get angry. And then I realized that like all of my life I'd been struggling with those things personally, but that there were also, again, this is where talking to other women, like when you think about anger and you think about women, what comes to mind? And I thought about the Greek myths and the Maenads, who were these kind of like raving, again, we go back to archetypes, right, of like these raving women who would go up and have these sacrifices. So they would sacrifice a bull and like dance around, and like people were terrified of them because it was this epitome of what happens when, so we expect women not to get angry because when they do, it's very dangerous, right? And so that was kind of how the themes led to the illustrations. So like, what do we expect women to be? Who exemplifies somebody who stepped outside of that expectation? How do I tell that person's story? And then another thing that came up was this decision, and I think in academic writing, increasingly we have to think about this too. How much do we want to position ourselves? So I was thinking about people like Gloria Anzaldúa, and how she was so brilliantly able to bring her own narrative into writing about feminism and identity. And Bell Hooks, of course, who is just passed away and who I teach in my writing classes, also would bring like, I experienced this thing as a Black woman. So like, here's a story about my life, and now I'm going to get back to my narrative. But somebody asked me that too recently at an event, like, why did you include bits and pieces of your own story? Because it'd be hypocritical not to, if I just edited that out and didn't say like, I don't have children, right? And then I write a whole chapter about women who don't have children. Like, I have to tell people what my lens is, because I think in academia, we need to be more honest about that in academic writing too, and encouraging students. Also, I know we do a lot of that in our department of like encouraging students to think about their positioning, their experiences, and how that changes their point of view on texts that they're reading. But I had to do that too. And that came into so that shaped the themes as well, right? So like, of course, my personal experience came into it. And then of course, somebody on the internet is always like, I just couldn't relate to it, like, well, that's too bad. But thank you for that question.
Okay, we'll do one more online. Sorry, and then we'll go back. Stephanie writes, How would you describe the spirituality of the middle or liminal space of bivocationality as you have encountered it in historical or contemporary women? Question 2. How would you describe the generativity perhaps of overlapping vocations that might seem mutually exclusive, but find their embodiment in women with compounded commitments?
Wow, okay, where to start with that? What was part 1 again? Sorry.
Yeah. How would you describe the spirituality of the middle or liminal space of bivocationality?
Okay, so how do you spiritually live in the middle and bivocationality? I think a lot of us at the university can speak to that because many of us have. I've been thinking a lot since we came back to in-person teaching about the difficulty of kind of like how we had to move. We became very different teachers on Zoom, right? Like our whole style of teaching changed. We were very challenged by that. And I think that speaks to the idea of spirituality too, because a lot of clergy have struggled with, again, like Zoom church or Zoom synagogue and Zoom temple, and like, how do you minister to people through a camera? How do you spiritually sit with people? So bivocationality, again, is living out, like those of us who have a spiritual bent or a religious kind of bent, we sort of are always kind of like stuck in between secular and sacred, and sort of, so I've thought a lot about people who sort of live in both, and then come back to Polly Murray again, because Murray really exemplifies that, again, that tension of being, somebody who was a lawyer, who was in the civil rights movement, but had a deep religious life. And so how did that impact the way Polly Murray lived out, and first had to live out the vocation of a lawyer in order to understand that she needed to be a priest. So like she did that in midlife and made that transition in midlife. So I think she's a great model for many people who are interested in these questions, and I encourage people to read more about her and watch the documentary. And then I forgot what the second part of the question was. I'm sorry.
It's a big question. How would you describe the generatively of overlapping vocations that might seem mutually exclusive, but find their embodiment in women with compounded commitments?
Okay. Yeah, so again, like I think each of us exists in we're a Venn diagram, and I think that we need to just kind of like understand that changes with time. And then with women, it's like, parenting is maybe one of your bubbles, and then career is another, and then maybe taking care of aging parents is another. And where are you in the middle of that? Or maybe you're a writer and someone who teaches writing, but you also really care about the environment. And so like, where do you meet in the middle of that? I think as I think about the Venn diagram, I also think about like how it can move. It's not static. And so how we too much identify like at one day with more of one part of ourselves than another. And for women, there's especially that extra challenge of like, because there are social cultural expectations of what we should be, how much do we feel like this pressure to conform to those expectations on one day versus another? So like that is a fluid experience throughout our lives that changes. And I hope I answered that question. Sorry, that was a challenging question. I did my best. Yeah. Thank you.
Questions in the room?
I'm gonna give you my question and I'll give you my point of view. So you maybe understand a little bit about where my question's coming from. At one point in the book, you talk about like women, we're not able to be ordained, we ordain ourselves. Or like, I think some of this about like, how do we create new forms of religious life in the fact that the framework of discernible forms of religious life are constructed in a patriarchal system. So,
Right.
Julian Norwich is an important mystic was sort of put there by the male structure, and even women's religious communities in this country, a lot of it came out of women not being able to be parts of other parts of society, so these became refuges, but they're still dealing with the constraints of the rules having to run up through the Vatican and that kind of space. So I'm like, how could we dream a new form of religious life? And, informed by places like Incarnation Monastery, which is a more inclusive space in some ways. It's four men there, but people say prayers together and they do the best they can with inclusive language, and there's just a sort of expansive spirit there. Point of view is, I go to mass at St. Columba's Incarnation, but also I'm in Berkeley because I'm here for Episcopal Seminary. But I was raised in the Roman Catholic Church.
Oh, you're my target audience.
I was able to get to the point of, I started discerning the priesthood when, and the person who has guided me and was my patron of being received in the Episcopal Church was Paul Murray.
Wow. Okay.
Um,
Really, your target audience.
Yeah.
So I'm here because I feel like I'm gonna take a lot of, like we're sort of swimming in similar waters, but thinking of the nuns and what is it in a world that is so broken. I do think there is something in the best of sense of faith and a kind of sense of transcendence, and there's something more that we don't have to accept from the filthy rotten system, as Dorothy Day would speak of.
Yeah.
And what are we going to build together? I think in some ways liberal and progressive culture, or any culture, even of the right, in a kind of polarized way, is so bent on sort of defending territory and breaking things down that we've lost a sense of what it's like to build something as a collective.
Thank you. And I think you're absolutely right. We do need a new form of religious life, because if religion's going to survive in the USA in particular, it needs to show up. So one of the other things that Molly Baskett, who's the pastor she always says, church act like a church. So like, how is churches don't do a very good job in America anymore of being visible, because there's almost this kind of embarrassment about that. Like, so, you know, I go to Pride and I see churches marching in Pride, and I think that's really amazing and cool. But I also know that some people boo them, you know, and say, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And so, so there's this kind of conflict there. I think the Bay Area, we really exemplify this problem in a lot of ways, which is that there's a lot of good, welcoming churches that want to make a better world, that want to show up at the protests and get arrested and do the Dorothy Day thing and like live with the poor and serve the homeless. But it's difficult for them to break through the static again of the narrative that religion is, you know, is hijacked by the religious right. So I think a new form of religious life. I think the pandemic showed us a lot of that. A lot of it's individualistic. So a lot of it's more kind of like meeting people one-on-one and sort of seeing what their needs are and how do you create community out of mutual need. So I've been really interested in the mutual aid movement. So how do you, when your neighborhood doesn't have enough food, you put a refrigerator on the street and you put it out there and you tell people they can come get food. When your neighborhood doesn't have enough books, you put a little free library. And so why are all the little free libraries in wealthy neighborhoods? That's the other question I have living in the Bay Area. But yeah, how do we marry that desire and need for community with the fact that people want to be known and seen as individuals and not as a formless mass of like, you're my congregation, rather than like you're individuals who I've been called to, you know, to serve. The fact that churches are shrinking and all, you know, this is across all religions, synagogues, mosques, everything's shrinking. So like fewer people go to a worship service. And again, the pandemic sort of highlighted again people's need to still be in community. So there's fewer people who come to the Zoom church, but they get to know one another. They really know one another as individuals. It becomes sort of like, let's start a project, you know. So I think things like that. In Latin America, they during the 1970s, they had base communities. So if you don't know this, I'm not going to go through the whole story because I don't want to keep everybody here till the end of the day. But so like there weren't the death squads were killing priests and nuns who were there to like help these communities, and so they would get together and have church without a clergy member, and they called it a base, comunidad de base, right? So like my Spanish is terrible, but like but they would be like, again, like a mutual aid society / church. That's what we need, right? We need like churches that are mutual aid societies, but that also like welcome us as individuals. I think that the other problem is people feel like that they have to conform, they have to be reformed and conform to be part of religion. And, you know, I'm always like, yeah, you can believe some of it, but there's no, like, you don't have to buy every word. Like, who believes that God wrote every word in the Bible, like fundamentalists, but like, that's really a small minority of people. So we'll talk offline sometime. I'll get your email. But I think that's a really good question. You know, what form is religious life going to take in a world that, in a country where religion is sort of like, has a very specific kind of end goal in mind, which is electing people to office, right? That's very dangerous too.
Question?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was like,
for
earlier
sure.
today, I was
Yeah,
like,
we're-
Ronit, let's end early.
Yeah.
Tired. So, yeah, but we can do one more question.
I was talking to you about the fact that I have a really difficult time defining religion. So I was just gonna say, do you have a working definition?
Yeah,
Do you have a-
that's a good question too, because I always think of religion as sort of like a house for things that we believe, and like maybe your house is smaller or bigger than mine, and like, and maybe I only live in a little tiny house, and like like here in the Bay Area, it still costs $1 million, but it's, you know, 800 square feet. But like that religion is the case, the compartment into which we put these things that we believe. And you know, it just depends on, it's another Venn diagram. It's culture, it's race, it's like your country you live in. I've been so interested in the religious dimensions, of course, of like Russia, Ukraine, and like with the different churches doing different things, and like good church, bad church. So we got this whole narrative now of like the Ukrainian church is good and the Russian church is bad, and that's fascinating to me. But again, it's like, so religion is sort of like it's things that you believe, and it's a structure that you put those beliefs into. That's how I would define it.
That's really, really helpful.
Okay, good.
Especially for talking to my atheists. And that's
Yeah,
that's who I talk about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, I have some atheists too. So that's why I came up with that. Yeah. Anyway, thank you all, and especially Ronit and Othering Belonging. Everybody who's here gets a book, which I think is super generous of you. If you don't want the book, you can just leave it in a little free library in a low-income neighborhood. And thank you all so much.
For joining us today for writing this book. Thanks to OBI, the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, who I was
writing
remiss.
programs, co-sponsored.
Yeah, the history department. And for those who are interested in religion, the pandemic, wellness, questions of community, there'll be an all-on Zoom event on Thursday, March 31st, again at 4 o'clock. I know a challenging time, but Rifts and Revelations, how the pandemic has transformed religion in the United States, and also how the pandemic and how religion has transformed the, you know, changes in religion society in the US over the past 2 years due to the pandemic. So if you need information about that, feel free to talk to me or to Robin. If you're on the OBI listserv or the BCSR listserv, you'll get the registration for it. We'd love to see you. But again, thank you all for coming today, and hope to see you at another event and read the book.